There is water in Mars.
Good morning. So instead of looking at the screen, you'll all have to look at your sheets in front of you. The presentation has been copied out for everybody. My name is Todd Myers. I'm the Environmental Director at the Washington Policy Center. First, I want to say that if any part of my speech is unintelligible, it's not my fault. I live on the West Coast. I barely know where I am this morning. The second thing is that, as you heard last night, Patrick Michaels talked about that in every part of the country, as temperature increases, people start to adjust and the number of heat-related deaths declines, except in one city in America, or as Pat Michaels calls it, the dumbest city in America, Seattle. That's where we're based. And I'm not sure whether I should attest to that or not, but I will get my revenge this morning on him by my speech, which is primarily that you shouldn't listen to what scientists say anyway. So first, the problem is that when policymakers try to make decisions, you often hear, and this is especially true in climate change, the scientists say that we need to do this. You often hear this. Here's what the scientists say. Well, but what the scientists say is this. And I have this quote from David Suzuki where it says that he called for political leaders to be thrown in jail for ignoring the science behind climate change. The Union of Concerned Scientists says that they are the leading based nonprofit working for a healthy environment in a safer world. And then this quote was from one of our local scientists at the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group, where when she was asked, well, gee, what can we do? She said, check out the Apollo Alliance. The Apollo Alliance is pursuing a $300 billion public-private program to create 3 million new clean energy jobs to free America from foreign dependence in 10 years. So scientists often talk about, based on what we know as science, here's what you should do. Here are the policy implications of that. But what policymakers hear is something very different and much more complicated. I used to work at the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, and we were the primary forestry agency in the state, covering not only state forestry, but also private forestry. And there were always issues that would come up about how we ought to manage lands, especially when there were threatened and endangered species. Some of you may have heard of a bird that we have locally called the spotted owl. There was another bird called the marbled murrelet, which is in a similar sorts of situation. And so I would go and I would talk to the scientists in the agency about what we should do. And when I would talk with a biologist who studied the marbled murrelet, she said, what we ought to do is protect these areas, which is their habitat, and put buffers around those areas so that we make sure that even if there's some overlap, there's always going to be habitat for the marbled murrelet. I would walk down the hall and talk to a forester. And I would say, what should we do about the marbled murrelet? And the forester would say, you know what? The way forests work is that they're a mosaic of habitat. There's clearings, and there's old growth, and there's everything in between. And animals need all of that because it's an ecosystem. It's not just one type of habitat everywhere. Some animals like one, some animals like other, and that you ought to change and adjust that over time. So what's a clearing today is mature forest 100 years from now, and what's old growth today may be a clearing 100 years from now, and you need to make those changes throughout history, and that's how we focus on our harvesting. Well, if you think about it, those two answers are contradictory. One is saying that we need to set aside large areas and do nothing, and another one is saying that we ought to set aside no areas and that everything ought to move around. So who's right? They're both right. They're both scientists, and they're both right. And so a policymaker listens to these two people saying, how do we deal with the marbled murrelet? Give very different answers. And what does the science say to them? And the policymakers have a tough time dealing with that sort of answer. So the answer is science doesn't say what we should do about policy. So when you deal with this, policymakers have to sort out what does the science say. And I want to point out 5 pitfalls of relying on what the science says. And my point is not that you ought not listen to the science. The science is extremely important in making good policy decisions about environmental solutions and especially climate change. But you ought to recognize the limitations of that. And there's 5 that I'll point out today. The first is that you ought to recognize scientific myopia. Now, scientists focus on what they know. Specialization is a good part of science. People are climatologists, they are astrophysicists, they are biologists, because understanding a particular area of science is very complex. And the more you specialize, the more likely you are to understand those very complex aspects of science. But that specialization doesn't necessarily do good things when you're talking about policy. And in fact, activists take advantage of this. In Washington State, we looked at getting Forest Stewardship Council certification for our forests. And one of the things that they said was, you need to hire more biologists. And the reason they said that was that they know that biologists have one thing that is important to them above all others, and that is the animal they study. They care about that. And if you care about stopping timber harvests where those animals are, biologists will stand up for you because they have very low risk thresholds. They focus on that one animal. So they have myopia. This is not a critique, it is a reality. Okay? You see this especially in climate change. So for instance, if you ask a climatologist what's causing the change in temperature, they will say changes in the climate. If you ask an astrophysicist, they are more likely to say it's influences of the sun. And in fact, I even talked with an expert on polar science, and what he said he thought that happened in 1998 and what's been happening quite a bit at the poles is that ice has been moved away due to currents and other factors rather than climate change. And because ice is being pushed away from the pole, you have more exposed water. Water traps heat, whereas ice reflects it, and therefore that, he believes, is causing part of the influence at the poles. Well, so he has a polar-centric explanation. Is this surprising that climatologists think that climate is the key, that astrophysicists think astrophysics is the key, and that polar experts think that polar influences are the key? No, doesn't surprise me at all. But you have to recognize it. And it doesn't mean that any of them are doing bad science or bad people or are intentionally politicizing the data. It just means that they're myopic. So you have to recognize this. And I put in this quote here, if you'll turn to a page. Recent letter to the editor from a salmon biologist who was criticizing tribes in the Seattle area. And he said, I don't understand how these tribes, who I work with all the time on salmon restoration, are now using their tribal casino monies to go out and do economic development, because we all know that economic development is going to cause more runoff and things that hurt salmon. This makes no sense to me. Well, of course not. He's a salmon biologist. His focus is on salmon. And when people do things that hurt salmon, he's going to be very unhappy. The tribes, however, they want salmon restoration, but they also want economic development. And so his myopia leads him to focus on one and ignore the other. So go ahead and make sure that we recognize that sort of myopia. And when you're trying to make decisions, when you're trying to use that, understand that the scientists and the data that they're giving you is going to focus on those things. And there's some key questions to ask. What are the scientists' priorities and values? Are they emphasizing their own area of expertise to the exclusion of others? Do they look at science outside of their own area of expertise? Again, it's not a critique that they don't do that. It is expected that scientists focus on their area of expertise. That's what makes them good scientists in that area, but it also is a pitfall when dealing with policy. The second thing is to understand the risk. Understanding the level of risk is extremely important in policy trade-offs. Policy is always a trade-off of one thing versus another, and you've got to understand the level of risk that's involved. However, there are pitfalls when you ask scientists about the level of risk. And the first is that they tend to overestimate their own certainty about the data that they provide you. They think that what they're providing you is more certain than it often actually is. And that second, scientists are generally less risk tolerant in their own area. As I mentioned before, biologists don't want to see impacts to the animal that they are studying throughout their entire career. And so I have a chart in here under the Understand the Risk, where there's two charts. And 2 years ago, the Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington published a study that predicted that sea level rise in the Puget Sound would be 1 meter, 39 inches. And they included this sentence: "This is one of the best understood and predictable components of future climate." We know this. We've got this science cold, they said in October of 2005. Well, the Climate Impacts Group released a new study in January of 2008. where they said that sea level rise was not going to be 39 inches, it was going to be 13 inches. So they cut the projection to a third. And this is from an area that they claimed just 2.5 years ago that they knew cold, that they were very sure of what the data was. Turns out that they weren't exactly so sure what the data was, and they've had a significant downward revision. As I said before, scientists are also less risk tolerant to things that impact their area of study. In 1970, scientists worldwide said there were about 10,000 polar bears. They were very worried, and they even put out a statement that said they're headed toward extinction. Today, there are about 24,000. And what do scientists say? They're headed toward extinction. They're very worried about the animal that they're studying. I understand that. But again, you as a policymaker have to understand that when they say, we're worried about the thing that we've been studying, of course you are. But that doesn't mean that the risks are real. It could mean that the risks are exaggerated. And you just always have to keep that in the back of your mind. So when you're understanding the risk, ask how risk tolerant the scientists are in their area. How risk tolerant are they regarding the economics in that area too? Because often they will emphasize the impact of the animal and forget about the impact to humans. So make sure that when you are looking at science and you're looking at the science that you get from them, that you remember those key pitfalls about the quality of the data. But even if the data is correct, scientists often have difficulty translating that data into good policy solutions. So there are 3 things that I'll point out real quickly here. And the first is that science does not dictate the solutions. There are a variety of reasons for this. One could be traditions. So in Europe, they're very comfortable with nuclear. We don't tend to like nuclear here in the United States. But we are very comfortable with bioengineering. They don't like genetically modified organisms. You have to remember that those traditions vary from area to area, and that the favored solution of one scientist may not be the favored solution of society at large for a reason that has nothing to do with the science and simply has to do with local traditions. The second is that the economic well-being of that area makes a big difference. As income goes up, the marginal gain in utility from each of those increments of income goes down. So a policy in China is not going to be the same as a policy in the United States, where we have a tremendous amount of money. There was one study I looked at that said that Americans have 40% more disposable income than Europeans. We're willing to take some risks with our money in a way that the Europeans and certainly the Chinese are not, and you have to take those things into account. You can't simply say, well, economics be damned, we've got to follow the science. Economics makes a big difference in what you do in each of those areas. So that's the first thing, is that science doesn't dictate those solutions. The second thing is that you need to recognize the law of unintended consequences. Alec Tabarrok is an economist at George Mason University. Don Boudreau, who's the chair, is speaking later today. But this is a great quote, and I love this, and it should be applied to everything we think about. It says, the law of unintended consequences is what happens when a simple system tries to regulate a complex system. Think about what could be more complex than trying to understand the nature of climate change. We heard this morning about that the IPCC keeps adding new influences in their examination of what is impacting the climate. And if you're trying to take a very simple system and influence all of those things, you're likely to have unintended consequences. I'll just give you one example. In Washington State, one of the strategies that is being discussed is growth management, where we do urban planning and dictate where people live and how they commute. Well, a new study from the University of Washington found that of a $430,000 home in Seattle, $200,000 of that value was due to growth management regulation. Nearly half of the value was due to growth management. Now, the first thing that scares me is that people don't see that. It's not like a tax. They can't recognize the cost because it's sort of hidden in there. But it is an unintended consequence. And so when you're trying to manage how people live and move and where they work, it's a very complex relationship, and simply putting regulations on that is causing massive unintended consequences. They can also be very abstract. So for instance, Cass Sunstein, in his book, Worst Case Scenarios, which I recommend, it's excellent, talks about the fact that some studies have shown that a statistical life is lost for every expenditure of $7 million. So every time government spends $7 million, a statistical life is lost. Another study showed $15 million. Now, it's not a direct impact. You can't point to the person. But you can point to the impact of taking that money away from families and out of the economy and giving it to the government, and it has an impact. And so those can be very abstract, but they do exist. And so that's why when you have policies that are extremely expensive, you can be working at cross purposes with what your goal is. Lastly, I'll talk about the scientific planning bias. Now, science is linear and rational. And people on the market tend to be murky and, frankly, irrational sometimes. But that approach runs counter to the scientific method, and this is one reason why the economic system is that most relied on central, rational planning emphasized its basis in science. My master's is in Russian studies. I know they talked about science a lot in planning their economy. It didn't work out very well, and the reason is that it's not always rational, and the way that information emerges in a market is very unpredictable. So the problem is that scientists see the problem, and they see a linear path from getting from here to there. That's what they do. They say, here is the cause. How do we deal with the cause? In a market, it doesn't often work like that, and it's very difficult to plan the path. And so there's two quotes that I have here that I really love. One is from Thomas Sowell in his book Knowledge and Decisions. It says, those who feel that their values are the values, the less controlled systems necessarily present a spectacle of chaos, simply because such systems respond to a diversity of values. It's hard to understand. It seems like chaos because it's very nonlinear. Friedrich Hayek says the same sort of thing. He says susceptibility to planned approaches would diminish if such persons, i.e. scientists, understood better the role that abstract and spontaneous ordering patterns play in all of life. That's the way the market works. It's very difficult to plan. It's very difficult to know what direction. But scientists tend to have a planning bias because that's what they're trained to do. They're trained to see cause and effect relationships, and they're trained to address those causes and effects. The market doesn't work. And oftentimes when I'm asked, okay, so you're a market, you focus on market solutions, what does that mean? Tell me how we get from here to there. And my answer oftentimes is, I don't know. But I know somebody knows. And what I want to do is make sure that somebody who knows has the incentive to do it. That is an extremely unsatisfactory answer. Very unsatisfactory, especially to a scientist. And so a scientist who comes to you and says, well, Todd, you know, I don't believe in Tinkerbell. I'm not going to click my heels and hope that something comes together, and I'm certainly not going to follow what you say. I understand that. But that's the way the market works, and that's why when taking scientists, policy options can be very dangerous because they have a bias in a particular direction about how we ought to solve those sorts of things. So, in conclusion, as I said, when I was working on policy at the State Department of Natural Resources, I always talked with scientists. I always listened to what they had to say. Their information was critical to making the decisions that were going to improve the way our forests work and meet all of those various values. But I didn't take their advice without recognizing that they were myopic sometimes, that they had more certainty about their data than was appropriate, and that their particular solutions focused on the goals that were most important to them. And the goals that were most important to them didn't always line up with the goals that were most important to the public. And so as policymakers, when we think about and sit down, how do we use this science, remember those things. So that when David Suzuki says to you that if you as policymakers don't do what he as a scientist want, you should be thrown in jail, you know that he's being myopic and you know the problem with that. Thank you very much.